So it's really an honor to be here. Thank you for having me. As Rachel said, I went to school at UNC, so it's great to be back in North Carolina. So I don't know how y'all usually do these things, but I don't like to just talk at people. So we're going to have questions during the talk. Yeah? I'm not feeling like the energy. Yeah? Yeah? Okay, cool. So we'll have time for questions at the end also, but we'll have time. I'd like, whenever you feel like there's something that's not clear, or you want to raise an issue, or you want to disagree, or anything like that, please, please, please raise your hand, and we'll do that. Okay. Before we get started, just so sort of we're all at the same basic point of what we're talking about here, I want to give a definition of health disparities that I'm using. And like any good academic, I'm not using my own definition, I'm taking someone else's. So this comes from Braverman et al. In 2010, but I think it's a pretty great definition of health disparities. And hopefully this will be the only thing I read. Health disparities are health differences that adversely affect socially disadvantaged groups. Health disparities are systematic, plausibly avoidable health differences according to race, ethnicity, skin color, religion, or nationality, socioeconomic resources or position, i.e. income, wealth, education, or occupation, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, geography, disability, illness, political affiliation, or other characteristics associated with discrimination or marginalization. These categories reflect social advantage or disadvantage when they determine an individual's or group's position in a social hierarchy. Health disparities do not refer genetically to all health differences or even to all health differences warranting focused attention. They are a specific subset of health differences of particular relevance to social justice because they may arise from intentional or unintentional discrimination or marginalization and, in any case, are likely to reinforce social disadvantage and vulnerability. Disparities in health and its determinants are the metric for assessing health equity, the principle underlying a commitment to reducing disparities in health and its determinants. Health equity is social justice in health. Okay, so now everybody knows what I'm talking about when I'm using the term health disparities, right? Right?
Yep. Yes.
All right. See, I'm like a teacher above all else, so I need. Okay. Oh, you're not seeing that. So first things first, the title is It's All About Poverty. It's actually really not all about poverty. It's all about poverty and how we structure inequality in this country, both in terms of historically as well as contemporarily. Poverty is one of the things that we use, but we also use things like, we have to remember that we live in a country that was founded on the principles of white supremacy and genocide, right? It's kind of important to remember. Patriarchy, capitalism, heteronormativity. And when I refer to heteronormativity, I refer to heteronormativity not just in the context of sexual identity, but also in the limitations of a binary of gender of male and female. So also we're talking about gender expression and gender identity. Ableism, xenophobia, national origin, language, we could go on and on. What I'm really interested in with all of the work that I do, whether it be research, teaching, is intersectionalities. And as Kawachi says, most of the history about thinking of inequality in the United States, including health inequality, has usually been framed in terms of race or class, but seldom both. So my work and what I'm really concerned about, and what I'm really concerned about us doing as a people and adopting a discourse about, is talking about how all of these things intersect. So maintaining inequality takes work. So the inequality that we have in the United States, because again, this talk is focused, what we're going to do today is focused mainly on, is focused on the United States, because once we begin to talk about inequality, health disparities in other places, they clearly exist, right? But the context is also different, so the conversation would have to be different. Have to remember that inequality is no accident, right? We have purposely structured our culture in a way that disadvantages people while also simultaneously advantaging people. And I think that's an important concept that we don't give enough attention to. We talk about issues like racism. We focus too much of the attention, I believe, on how racism negatively impacts groups of people, and we spend far too little attention talking about how the reason that we have racism, and especially in terms of a structural way, is because it positively benefits people, right? Like me. All right. When I say inequality is part of our ideological DNA, again, we live in a country that was founded on these principles, right? And it's really, really, really important to remember that. Structure inequality is intentional, as I spoke about. Structural inequality leads to institutionalized practices. So this is something I find that people get really stuck on a lot in terms of, we use the phrase institutionalized racism, institutionalized discrimination, but we don't really have examples of what that means. Does anyone here want to give an example of what they think that means? I'm happy to, but I'm also really wanting to get some participation.
Like grandfather clauses as far as voting practices, which don't really exist anymore, but like even in as far as education, like legacies is, I think, a grandfather clause for universities.
Okay, good. Anyone else?
So GI Bill was actually founded specifically to benefit, I believe, white males originally.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
To extend them to college and to make benefit of that, but it excluded other groups.
Yeah,
so
and
I believe it excluded Jews and blacks.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting one because that is part of the public discourse about how much we do for veterans and how we take care of veterans, historically at least. Now we all know that we don't really do anything. But that at least historically we did something, that gets touted all the time as something that was done. And as you said, yeah, that was done and that was great. That was also part of sort of the larger context of redlining in terms of who got houses and where you got to live. And those mortgages were not available to you unless you were white. Okay, good.
I'm sorry, can you clarify for me what you mean by structural inequality and institutionalized practices? Because in my mind, those are very much the same thing.
Okay, so what I mean by that is we can use the GI Bill as another example, right? So the structural inequality of the ideology of racism as part of the overall structure, right? When I say structure, I'm using structure in a way of sort of a social theory kind of structure, right? That like there's structure and then there's systems under structure, and institutions are systems. So racism is part of our ideology as the structure that we live in, right? But as an ideology, that has to be, in order for it to be really, really meaningful, or at least from my beliefs, in order for that to be meaningful, it has to be meaningful in systemic, institutionalized ways, right? So for example, like the problem with the sort of dominant narrative about racism, I always come back to racism, that's kind of what I focus on. So the dominant narrative on racism in the United States is that racism is something that is irrational, that only sort of people who don't know better are racist, and if everybody just had a black friend, and if people just knew better, like all of these kinds of things. It's all kind of in our head. It's called the psychological view of race, right? But I take more of what's called the structural view of race, which is that race is really all about a historical beginning, but also playing out today, unequal distribution of power and wealth. So if we have this unequal distribution of power and wealth, how do we maintain an unequal distribution of power and wealth without just simply like giving? Well, what we do is we have these things like the GI Bill, which actually does simply give to some people and not give to others, but it does it in an institutionalized, sort of legitimized way. Does that make any sense?
Yes. I'm just trying to trace through like longitudinally, right? So you could have changes in the level of structural inequality that may not be reflected in the level of institutionalized practices.
Absolutely.
And it seems like a feedback loop, right? So
Absolutely.
the institutionalized practices would also feed into
Absolutely.
the structural inequality.
Absolutely.
Okay. I think I know where you're at. I'm with you. Sorry, it took me a little longer.
No. That's so also very much related to this is the myth of meritocracy, right? This notion in the United States that the United States is this open system. Anybody can be anything they want. Race, gender, class, education level, doesn't really matter. What do you have to do if you want to get ahead in this country? You simply have to
Work harder.
Work hard, right? We all know this myth, right? And that's great in theory, right? Sounds really good. But we also know that that's not necessarily always true. That's not necessarily true, right? We know that there are impediments to people actualizing what they want to become, who they want to be, the level of education they seek to attain, that it's really not all about agency, right? There is this thing called structure. We've actually seen in the United States, like, even though that's true, the myth of meritocracy, the United States used to be the country that provided for the most opportunity in terms of upward social mobility, right? We've lost that. That's no longer the United States. Right now it's Northern European countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, etc. They all rank higher than the United States. We have the widening of the income and wealth gap at a level and a rate that is unprecedented, right? This is not new to anyone, right? And also we have a push, and I'm going to come back to this. We have this push for privatization that is a really, really, really big deal, both in the world of education and also in the world of health, right? I'm also going to argue that even though the name of the talk, I already told you how it's like it's not really what it is in one way, how it's not really all about poverty. It's also really not about health inequalities or health disparities. Because health inequalities and health disparities, I would argue, are simply manifestations of larger structural issues, right? They're important and we need to deal with them. And I'm not saying that we don't address them now while we work on fixing the structure. But I think we need to do both at the same time, right? Because there are actual people who are in actual pain today, and their lives are real, and their pain is real, and they're affected by health disparities and educational inequalities. But if we continue only to address those while not addressing the larger structural issue, we're just going to have to keep addressing those issues, right? Okay. Some of you maybe have seen this or where this comes from, but I just think it's just fascinating. Have you all seen this video? It's gotten like millions of hits on YouTube about health inequality. Wealth inequality. So it's this whole video on the widening wealth gap and the widening income gap. So I'm not going to show the video, but what I did want to show was this one graph, which comes from economics professors at Harvard who went out and interviewed people about what they think the distribution of wealth is in the United States, what they think the distribution of wealth should be in the United States, and what the distribution of wealth actually is in the United States, right? And we see pretty big differences, right? So we see that, I mean, the numbers aren't there, but we know that 1% of the population owns 40% of the wealth, 1% of the population owns 50% of the stocks and bonds, and even though stocks and bonds we're all, or not all, but a lot of us, anyone who has a retirement plan or anything like that, are affected. But the bottom 40% owns less than 1% of all the stocks and bonds in the United States, right? So the disparity is pretty big, right? Is everyone blown away by this? No? Really? Nothing?
That was the first time I saw it.
It's a rough crowd.
Familiar now.
All right.
Well, I'm always surprised why so many people think it's ideal to have that many at the bottom like this. Or like,
Okay, well,
wait,
say that again? I think I heard you, but
I'm just always confused about why the purple band is so large.
Ooh, I
and
have
the
this
ideal.
This?
Yeah. Why is that ideal?
Well, because I mean, I have an answer or a theory. It's because that's capitalism, right? Which we have like fetishized at this point, right? It's not that we just believe in it, and so we think it's quite okay. We also, we live in a country that it's fun. So these people, they're there because it's their fault, right? Because they haven't done what? Worked hard, right? Like, I'm with you. Like, it's insane to me, but there is a narrative that's part of our ideology that makes sense, right? That people think like, there's going to be some poor people, and the rich people are going to have and the rich are going to have basically the top 20 will have more than the bottom 40, and that's ideal, right? Because part of that also is this idea that this is okay, and this is okay, and what's important to understand is that the respondents to this survey represented folks who identified both as Republican and Democrat, represented folks who identified across sort of the socioeconomic spectrum, right? So we're not talking about just wealthy, we're not talking about just low-income folks. But part of why people like this is because these folks want to do what?
Move up.
They want to become this, right? And so if this somehow becomes something like this, or if we flip it, right, then it's problematic because then, right? So even though there's this recognition that there's very few people that are going to become that, everybody thinks they can become one of the people who does become that, right?
Has it ever looked like the ideal distribution, I guess? Is there a moment in history we can point to say, like... But see, this is when it gets kind of murky. I mean, the 1980s and part of the 80s and 90s showed a little bit more of what we call a healthy middle class. But it was sort of deceiving because then what happens to the economy after that, right? And what were the byproducts of that? The byproducts of that were a great deal of debt, right? The byproducts of that were a lot less spending on folks on social services and needs that then resulted in part of what we see today. The other time period that people point to is like the late 40s and early 50s, the post-World War II. But what's the problem with looking at that and glorifying that?
There's racial inequality and gender inequalities.
Yeah, not just inequalities, but like legalized, codified inequality, right? Like you couldn't vote, like, right? It's kind of hard for me when I hear people romanticize the 1950s. I'm like, yeah, I guess if you were a white guy, like that was great, but like, and it's not to say that those things aren't there now, right? Especially when we're living in a time when we just gutted the Voting Rights Act, right? So, yeah. I couldn't pass up that little graphic. One of the things that like I constantly am sort of dealing with and fighting against, particularly, this is not to marginalize or whatever anybody, but I teach graduate and undergraduate students, but I teach mainly undergraduate students. And there seems to be, particularly with this, things are so much better, things will never be perfect, that things are much better than they are today. Like, as it relates to things like, not just poverty, but things like racism, things like discrimination against folks because of gender identity or sexual identity. But what's interesting to me is when we're talking about race, it's always the white kids who are saying that, right? And when we're talking about gender identity, it's usually the straight white guys who are saying that. So I think that there's this while I think things are better today, I think we have to remember that they're not necessarily as good as we'd like, as we think they are, and as we'd like, hopefully, as we'd like them to be, right? But there's a balance. Like we do have to recognize things are better, right? Or I think they are.
Well, some things have gotten better, right? So like,
right.
The legal codification of racial inequality is not with us anymore to the same extent. And things have gotten better. But with wealth inequality, you could argue you seem to be arguing things have gotten worse, and there's evidence to support that.
Absolutely, and you can argue that, or not even argue, you can just say, because it's a fact, that we have a speaker in the House who refuses to even bring up to the floor, take a vote on federal legislation that would end discrimination against folks because of sexual identity in the workplace. Like, we still live in a country that doesn't have a federal law that outlaws discrimination because of your sexual identity in the workplace, right? So to me, that's kind of a big deal, right?
Right. Right, but again, that's better than 5 years ago.
I know, when it wasn't even being discussed, right? So,
So the things are better argument carries some weight, but you have to be clear about what you're talking about.
Exactly, but I also think what I said before about who's saying this, I really think it matters, particularly as a person who's always saying these things from every privileged position possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like a straight white guy with a PhD, like just name every way you can be privileged and that to me, right? So like, I have a hard time being like, no, it's better, because it's like, well, for you it always was, right? That's not true, because there's a Jew there.
It's a Jew thing.
Yeah, I got the Jew thing working. Well, besides that, and you really can't argue for systematic discrimination or systematic anti-Semitism in the United States anymore. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and it's spreading in other parts of that's a whole other talk. Okay, but we have a black president. That's my favorite, right? And we have to remember, though, that's not like that's funny and everything, but it's not. But that was like the op-ed in the Wall Street Journal the day after the president won the first time, right? Like their op-ed was, "Shut up, stop whining, there's a black president, there's no racism." It's the Wall Street Journal, right? Like that's not, whether we like that paper or not, that's not like some fringe whatever, right? Ann Coulter, who I know, whatever, but Ann Coulter just, I don't know if it's her last book or the one before that, but sold millions of books, the one about racism, right? That was basically like, we did away with racism when we passed the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act. It's only you mainly white liberals, somehow, again, I'm full, who are whining about these things, right? And millions of people bought that stuff and believed that stuff, right? What's the alternative? This is a really fun one to live in Miami because of the Cuban community, because every time you want to critique capitalism, somebody's there with a story about communism and Marxism. Somebody who's never read Marx also, which is really, that's a fun one to get into with a Cuban person. Yeah, and the erroneous impression things are better than they really are. Okay, so I'm like all over the place. Okay, so I think one of the things that's really influential in trying to impact structural change is the way that we, on a day-to-day basis even, beyond policy change, beyond things like that, the way that we on a day-to-day basis talk in our spheres, whether it be personal, academic, whatever. So a couple colleagues of mine, Jeffrey Duncan Andrade and Ernest Morel, I really like, they wrote this book, it's a quote from the beginning of their book a couple years ago, and I guess I have to read it even though I know you are all reading it. And then we'll talk. Let us begin by rethinking the position that urban schools are failing. And when we say urban schools, we know that what that's code for, right? That's code for schools where white kids don't go. Okay. When one set of schools is given the resources necessary to succeed and another group is not, we've predetermined winners and losers. This is where the urban school reform rhetoric has missed its mark. It is presumed that urban schools are broken. Urban schools are not broken. They're doing exactly what they were designed to do. This is kind of like the framework I use for teaching a couple of the classes that I teach, which is to say that if we view schools as systems, right? And we all admit that, like, okay, some of the outcomes we're not happy with, to say the least, right? But if we view schools as systems, the system is working perfectly. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's doing exactly what it's designed to do. If you looked at the system in terms of like what we're putting into the system and what we're getting out of the system, it'd be very hard to argue that we would expect anything less. Does that make sense? I'm getting like some yeses, some no. Like, yeah, does that make sense? I mean, it's very antithetical to the way that we talk in our country, right? Because we talk about how we love every child matters. No, they don't, right? I mean, they do to me. I know y'all don't know me, so my tone is like, okay. Who is this guy that sings? Screw kids. No, but we can say, like, you know, you're going to run for public office, and who's going to say, yeah, screw the kids, right? Everybody's going to say, like, yay, you know, lollipops for everyone, or whatever. But in terms of actual practice, in terms of the way that we actually set up these systems, we set up the systems so they look like what they end up looking like. So for me, like, if I'm in some sort of like social setting and I'm meeting someone, and inevitably happens that, you know, they're like, hey, what do you do? I teach education, whatever. Their first question is always like, what do we do about schools? I'm like, really? At the bar? What I first say to them is, I'm like, you know, it depends on who you're talking about in terms of American public schools. If you're a kid of privilege, you're doing fine, right? Even in terms of, I don't necessarily believe that much in a lot of these international comparisons. I think they're really problematic in terms of the methodology. But even if we do believe in those, if you look at privileged kids in the United States, they're doing fine compared to kids in other countries. It's not like it's one, we can't look at things like it's one system, right? If we look at kids in rural areas, and if we look at kids in what we call inner cities, those are the kids that aren't doing fine, right? And so we have to sort of say, so when someone says to me, what do we do about schools that are broken, which is, I think, what Jeff uses too. Just such a weird word, right, that they're broken. They're not really broken. I mean, I go to schools, like, within the same, Miami-Dade County Public Schools is the 4th largest school district in the country. So I can go to schools that, you know, the incomes are in the bottom 1% of the United States. There's zip codes in the bottom 1% of incomes in the United States. And I can go to schools that are in the top 5%, right? They look like completely different places, right? From the curriculum, even though the curriculum is supposed to be standardized, because the teachers in the top 5%, what's that word I'm looking for? Put stuff
Circulate.
in. Huh?
Circulate. They move.
Enrich, thank you. They enrich the curriculum. And also their pedagogy. I mean, everything is just different, right? They're different places. So we have to understand. And so I think it's important when people ask me what's, you know, I always say to folks, things are fine, you know, in terms of the system. Now, in terms of the outcomes, that's where we have the problems, right? Like, I don't like that there was a study done in Chicago several years ago that, I don't have it cited here, I didn't use it, but there was a study done in Chicago several years ago where you could predict within one standard deviation, you could predict a kid's SAT score, which again is problematic, whatever, and their GPA in school with 2 pieces of information: their mother's level of education and their zip code. That was what you needed, right? So we've sort of determined what kids are going to, like, how well kids are going to do in school based on factors that have actually nothing to do with school, So this gives us a picture of low-income students. I have, in case anyone's interested, I can send you the PowerPoint, but I have all the references at the end. I haven't used PowerPoint in like 10 years probably, so this is really hard for me to do. So I can figure out how to get this and this citation on the same slide. The most recent data, this report just came out, and actually I can tell you now, from the Southern Education Foundation. It came out in October of this year. And so the data is from 2011. And how they define percentage of low-income students is students who qualify for free and reduced lunch, which is to say students who live in a family whose income is at 185% of poverty. We got that? Okay. But, and we'll go through some of these numbers, but what's interesting to note is that some school districts, Dallas Independent School District just did this. Dallas Independent School District is a huge school district, and definitely not known for being progressive. Dallas Independent School District just decided that they would, all kids get free and reduced lunch. Why would they do that?
Stigma.
No.
To reduce the stigma.
That's very sweet. No, it is. It's very sweet that they would care.
It look better on paper.
No. Because it was more costly for them, it was less costly for them, rather, to give all kids free and reduced lunch than to go through the bureaucratic process of all the paperwork involved for the kids signing up to get free and reduced lunch, because it had reached this point where they were like, you know, it's so many of them that we might as well just forget that as part of like what we're having people do for a job and just give free and reduced lunch and breakfast, excuse me. They give breakfast and lunch in Dallas now to all kids for free, because that's how bad it's gotten. North Carolina is at 50%. I know I've moved from North Carolina, but I keep track. I know things politically in North Carolina are just swell right now. My other saving grace is that I'm from Texas, so things there are even, you know, sweller. So we look, and we'll look at a couple maps, and we can see how it's not, well, to me it's not really surprising, how a lot of it is clustered in the South. And the states with the highest are New Mexico's at 67.6, Louisiana 65.5, Mississippi 70.6. We used to have a saying when I was growing up in Texas, thank God for Mississippi, otherwise we'd be last in everything.
They say the same thing.
Yeah. You've all taken that from us. Yes, ma'am.
You may have already mentioned this, but what is your definition of low-income student?
So the definition of low-income student is students who qualify for free and reduced lunch. And what that is students whose family income is at 185% of the federal government's definition of poverty. So for the year this was done, for a family of it was for a family with one child, and again, family, right? It was $30,000. So that's 185%, right? And of course, that number varies in terms of what that gives you, what that buys you, depending on where you live, right? As someone who lives in Miami now, I can tell you that, like, I love living in North Carolina more for lots of reasons, but it's cheaper to live here, right? I mean, everything's cheaper. So, and California, one of the reasons that California and Oregon are so high, particularly California, is because the cost of living there is so high. Same with New York, right? Got lots of maps. So somebody asked earlier about how this has changed, or was it better? This just shows over the last 10 years how it's gotten worse. So like in New Mexico, it's jumped, or 11 years, it's jumped 12%. Mississippi 8%. Florida is 56%, and before it was in the less than 50%. But we can see that places where it's changed the most are the same places on the other map where it had the highest rates of incidence, right? Or the highest numbers of kids.
Are you asserting that this is due to institutional changes, that the rules have changed to make things worse for poor people? This is a function of increasing inequality?
Say that again.
So is this a deliberate effect of changes to the system to increase inequality?
I would say yes, and I can explain that in a second.
Okay.
But I use it as a sort of example when we talk about the widening income gap and the widening wealth gap, that even in the last 10 years, this is how much worse it's gotten, right? But yeah, I mean, I think that whether we look at things like the way that that laws were written in the wake of the market collapse with too big to fail, and who got rescued, right? It was large corporations as opposed to individual people. If you owed Citibank money, like, you know, there was this idea that was floating around that was, somebody, what's his name, Krugman picked it up, but like, instead of giving money to somebody like Citibank, right? Maybe the federal government could have given money to everyone who owed Citibank with the guarantee that you have to then give it to Citibank. So Citibank still gets their money, but what happens to you? Your debt goes away, right? So it's sort of like everybody wins, but that didn't really happen, right? Because not everyone is like so sweet and concerned about the kids. And, you know. We'll talk more about that. This is an interesting number. There's a whole lot of factors. I just wanted to share real quick. This is the way that school funding is determined is per pupil. So this is why we get things like, and there's several districts and states do it differently, just like they do everything in education, because we're still this states' rights country thing. But that's why, like in several states, like mine, in Florida, and this happens in most places, there are several days of the year where they base the student population at the school on those days for funding. And so what some schools have been known to do, this is totally illegal, but they do it anyways, they hire people to go out and round up kids that they know are skipping school, and they know where they are, and they're just like, you know, yo, can you just come today, please? Like, not going to be in any trouble, we don't care, we just want you. That was my first yo. I've been watching my yos and my cursing. I'm a dude, I don't know what the culture is here. So what I find to be more interesting than just these numbers, because again, it kind of makes sense to some degree that, like, if you live in Pennsylvania or New York, or, you know, it costs more to live there. So, right? But what's also interesting is that we spread that money around differently within those states. So, like, New York City is a great example where, if you look at how much we spend on per pupil in New York City, and then as you go out into the rings of the suburbs, and you get to the wealthier and the wealthier, that number jumps, right? It jumps from like 12. I think the last numbers I saw were like 12,000 to 17,000 to 23,000. Like just in those sort of concentric circles that you can draw about the suburbs, right? And to me, that means we value those kids more.
Are you referring to state spending per student or total spending per student? So including local funding then?
Yeah, and we know that depending on where you live, you know, the vast majority of school funding comes from state and local funds, right? It's only about 11 or 12% that the federal government contributes to a school board's budget. Or maybe 13%. The rest of it comes from state and local. Now, depending on where you live, you know, like in North Carolina, Florida, we don't have state income taxes, so there can't be any sources there. So it really just depends. Some states use, it's really hard to talk about school funding because in terms of specific, because it varies from state to state so much. And some states basically rely on, some states kind of split it up a little more evenly. Some states, we just have this notion, this discourse in our country that, yes, I bought a house that costs more than yours does. I pay more taxes than you do. Therefore, my child deserves a better education than yours does. Because again, if we go back to what we said at the beginning, because if you wanted a better house and you wanted a better job, you would just
work harder.
Right, you know? So the other thing is, and Rachel and I were having this conversation earlier, the other thing that goes on in really affluent communities is that at the public school level, because being advantaged isn't enough of an advantage, so the advantaged have to advantage themselves more, they do things like, it's perfectly legal, like I know in Florida, for PTAs to raise money to hire people, like to pay people salaries, right? To have reading specialists and math coaches and things that other schools would love to have, and also, quite frankly, things that other schools need more, right? And it's perfectly legal for them to do that. There are people who, you know, where like at a PTA meeting they'll say, oh, we lost this funding and this and that, and so we're going to lose our reading specialists, and so parents are just like, well, how much would that cost, right? Like we live in that world where that can happen. And the other thing with that, I just want to say real quick in terms of the teachers, not only in terms of funding, because it's not all about funding, we put the the least experienced teachers in what we call the highest or highest need or hardest to serve or all that, all those euphemisms we have, right? That's where we put the most inexperienced teachers, right? If you get a degree in teaching and you go out and get a job, you're not getting a job teaching AP English in an affluent suburb, right? That's not the job you're getting. I mean, does it happen? Of course it does, but that's not the job you're getting. Programs like Teach for America, which I'll try to limit my, we put kids who don't even have a background in teacher education, right? We put them in rural areas and in low-income urban areas. That's where we put those teachers, right? So the teachers, like I think of my kids. I think my kids need good teachers way less than a lot of other kids do, but they get the best teachers because of where they go to school, right? Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about health. 12:40. Okay. So again, it's somewhat difficult to make links to things, even though they are linked, but what they're linked by is something that underpins both of them, right? And that is the structural inequality, the structural poverty. So we could pick a whole lot of things, and I have some other examples too, but one of the things that I'm sort of really just personally interested in right now is food. Not like because I'm hungry, but like access to food, this kind of thing. Because we can talk about, and as Rachel was saying in like my intro, I used to focus on, my work used to be on disparities in breast and cervical cancer in Haitian community in Miami. But this is actually an issue in that community too. And what's interesting is that your income and place predict your education, right? Because your income predicts where you can live, right? And where you go to school is predicated on where you live, right? So your income really predicts where you're going to go to school. And then your income and your education predict your health in many ways. From all of these are two of the biggest indicators in terms of health. What's also really interesting is one of the biggest indicators in terms of academic outcomes for kids is access to quality, affordable health care. Because if kids are sick, that they either can't go to school or they go to school sick more likely than not. Because if you're this is the thing we all a lot of folks who are not low-income folks have to remember is that if you have a job, like for me, I get paid if I take the day off if I have a sick kid, right? But if I work a wage job where I get paid by the hour and my kid is sick and I stay home, then I don't get paid that day, right? So that's why a lot of kids go to school sick. It's not because their parents don't care. It's not because they don't love them. It's not because it's because they're worried about keeping the lights on, right? Access to quality health care is a huge indicator in terms of how well a kid's going to do in school. So in terms of health, for me, it was maybe like, it was like 15 years ago or so. It blew me away. I never realized I was working with homeless folks and how you could be simultaneously obese and malnourished. Like that would, to me, that just didn't make sense. And then it was like, oh yeah, I get it. But I think for a lot of people who don't spend time around these issues, I think that they don't really understand that. And then the reason that a lot of folks, not all folks, but by any stretch, but the reason that we have higher rates of obesity and higher rates of heart disease and higher rates of diabetes amongst low-income folks is the availability of quality, nutritious food, right? And so we have things like food deserts where people have no access to anything other than convenience stores, fast foods. They don't have availability to grocery stores, fresh produce, neighborhood gardens, or farmers markets. The other thing is that that I'm beginning to see a little bit in the literature. And again, it's not what I focus on, but it's something I pay attention to. Is folks who are like, once you've had a couple generations of people, like somebody who their mother, their grandmother, whatever, have grown up in this sort of context, you can't just give them fresh produce, right? And be like, go have dinner. We all of us in this room who cook, at some point or another, we were taught how to cook, right? Or we learned, somehow we learned, it wasn't just like in our DNA that we were like, oh, I know what to do with these. So there has to be but this is something that people don't think of. So like very well-intentioned people set up neighborhood gardens and maybe even do it in a really great collaborative, participatory way and all that stuff. And then the harvest comes in and it's like, so now what do we do? Like well-intentioned people that came in and helped us do this. And so there has to be this part of the process whereby people are actually taught this is what you do, right?
I don't know what everybody.
These are a couple of, these are hey, can we see this? Or was it too? All right, I'll talk it now. These were 4 things that I thought were really interesting because they don't really give the picture that we necessarily would imagine they do. So this one over here is life expectancy at age 25. So here we have black, Hispanic, and white. The white, these things are, this is less than 100% of FPL, which is the federal poverty level. This one is 100 to 199. This one is 200 to 400. This one is 400 and above. We see with every group really how your income in combination with your race, because look, you know, the especially for white folks is larger than it is for black folks, but not for Hispanic folks, which is interesting. But we see how income changes your life expectancy, no matter your race, right? Except for this little dip right here. Then we have percent without excellent, very good health. I would have to get out the article to define that. So, whatever, you're healthy. So, right, it's good enough. So again, this is white is not high school graduate. The next dark one is this is high school graduate, then some college, then college graduate. Any thoughts?
Is race as small of a factor in terms of health as it appears to be in that graph? I mean, it seems to be income really has considerably larger differences, but it's small and I can't quite read the bars.
Yeah, no.
That one's education.
Thank you.
Right.
No. Yeah, I mean, this is where we get into, I think, for me at least, I still can't tease them apart.
Okay.
And I'm very suspicious of, there are folks who claim that they can. I like the other folks who say they can't, maybe because I can't. Because I think that there is such an interaction, such an intersectionality when we talk about race, ethnicity, and income level in this country, that to try to like look at them in a vacuum apart from each other, as I just think, I don't really know where that gets us. So, I mean, I think that, like, you know, on this one it shows much more than here, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that this is percentage with chronic heart disease, 25 years or older. I think here, you know, again, it's more, I think, about income, right? It's not more about income, but like the difference between here and here is not as great as here and here.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Wasn't there that paper that came out recently that said, like, poor white women have seen their life expectancy decrease, like, 3 years in the last 20 years or something like that?
Yeah.
And so, like, you know, in comparison to everybody else, it's going up, and they're, among poor white women, it's going down.
Yeah, it's interesting because, and one of the reasons that, that not in that paper, but I saw a response to that paper, that, you know, that we forget, because we've painted this sort of racist picture of who receives social service benefits, particularly like SNAP and WIC and other food benefits, we've painted this picture that's not a white picture of who receives those benefits, even though the vast majority of people who receive those benefits are white. And so it surprises us sort of, or it surprises a lot of people initially, but then we realize that we've been unraveling the social safety net for everyone, right? It's not just something, but we have to also realize while it impacts white people as a majority, it impacts people who are not white disproportionately, right? So it impacts people, there's a higher percentage of people who are not white who are on some sort of assistance, but there's a larger number of people who are white who are on that assistance, right?
Right.
So, so yeah, there's nothing really being done for the poor white woman either. You don't look...
it's a lot to process, you know.
Good, that's a good compliment, I'll take that. Someone had it, yeah.
I just had a thought, and I apologize if I'm stealing some thunder. One of the graphs, if you're using the data set that I think, there's the difference between a poor, uneducated white woman and a well-educated, well-to-do black woman, and their birth outcomes.
Yes.
And the well-educated, well-off black woman actually has worse outcomes than the poorest, white, uneducated woman. My theory for that is that the white teenage mother is a pitiable object and she needs assistance. But when you look at the outcomes, she actually doesn't. It's the well-educated African-American woman that's doing worse and needs the programs directed to her. So just one thing to kind of bring some of your
Yeah, well, there's a lot that goes on with that. I mean, like when you said, I don't even think it has to. I don't even think we have to reduce it to just women who are 19 or younger when they have their kids, but women who have more of a support system there, including healthcare, but not limited to healthcare. We know that that's very, very valuable. I was just having a conversation last night with a friend of mine whose wife does work in this area. We were talking about, sort of because of a friend of ours who's dealing with whatever, but how stress is such an important factor in infant mortality and maternal health outcomes and everything that has to do with outcomes with pregnancy. That and we forget, and there's all this literature out there about how, being poor and living in it means you not necessarily like live in a linear way, but there's all this research on how being poor basically means you're living in a constant state of stress, right? Because you don't know, like, where am I going to get money for food? How am I going to pay the rent? Whatever. What happens when the baby comes? How am I going to be able to feed the baby? All of these things, right? That impacts your health as well as the baby's health, right? So this notion, it's the idea of like having social support systems that are there versus not having social support systems.
But then you can also get brought down by being the best in your class. So that also is what happens, I think, with the African American, that particular population, is by being the best, you're having to carry the burden on your shoulders. You don't necessarily have the support, or I'm phrasing it really badly, but other people are bringing you down, ultimately. I'm just thinking about minority, again, birth outcomes. I'm explaining it badly, so I'll let you go.
No, I think I understand what you mean. Yeah.
John Henryism is what I'm going for.
Huh?
John Henryism?
Yeah, I don't think you were explaining it badly. Okay. Well, I understood it either way. So I want to move towards a couple things in terms of, here's a great place for intersectionality, right? Because we're moving towards the end. So here's a place where we can, connection, right? So zero tolerance, right? And we can apply it to two things. You can apply it to drug use and abuse and its relationship to education. Now, first of all, drug use and abuse. There was this really interesting study that just came out, Nicosia et al. I'm not going to list all the people. But it was a study that was just published this year in the American Journal of Public Health about, it was looking at folks in California who get arrested for nonviolent drug offenses and who gets diverted to treatment programs and who goes to prison. And surprise, surprise, and it was looking at just men, actually, in the study. White men who got diverted to court-mandated treatment, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, exponentially greater than black men, and the difference between white and Hispanic men was smaller. It was there, but it wasn't quite as big as it was between white and black men. So we have to ask sort of why, right? Number one, we've made, I know there's some public health folks in this room, and if not, well, whatever. I feel like I don't have to say this, but we've chosen to make a public health issue a criminal justice issue, and the reason for that, in terms of drug use and abuse, I would argue that the reason for that is because we can make more money off of people going to prison, right? Prison is a huge industry, and there's all these statistics now about how the percentage of the population who's incarcerated in the United States has gone down in the last 3 years. That's true, but the number of people has gone up because our population has increased. So a 2% dip or a 1.5% dip when there's 100,000 new, basically clients, right, or customers who are in prison. And that's the thing we have to remember, right? Prisons have largely been privatized, right? We've done that with prisons. That's why we're sort of moving to schools next, right? And I wish that was a joke, but because there's a huge profit motive. Right? And that's where we get something like the, are you all familiar with the idea of the school to prison pipeline? Right? It's one of the ways that we kick kids out of school. Kids who are not white are much more likely to be suspended or expelled from school for disciplinary reasons than white kids are for the same infractions. We know that what happens to kids when they are suspended or expelled, every time they're suspended or expelled, they're more and more likely to drop out of school. Just like we know that if a kid doesn't pass the end of the year exam in 3rd or 4th grade and they're held back, they're exponentially more likely to drop out of high school or never finish high school. We do these things anyways. We have these policies in school, these zero tolerance policies. They lead to things like beyond just being kicked out of school, even if you remain in school, if your eligibility for federal loans to attend institutions of higher education, you are in many cases not eligible at all, and then if you want to be eligible, there's a process you have to go through to get your eligibility back, just like if you're in prison and you want to get your voting right back, if you're eligible for that. Which leads to this whole thing of social reproduction, right? So the white kid who gets caught smoking pot and nothing happens to him or her versus the kid who's not white or the kid who's not wealthy or the kid whose parents don't have a lawyer or et cetera, right? And the white kid is less likely to need the loan anyways, right? Not that white kids don't need loans. I needed loans. But we just know disproportionately white students are less likely to need assistance. And we talked about the disproportionate suspensions and expulsions. I don't know, do we have any questions about that?
Can you explain how prisons are profit-driven?
Yeah,
Prisons
so,
are not paying, right?
huh?
Like, you don't have to pay to go to prison, right?
No, we pay.
The government.
We don't pay the government anymore. We pay the government, and the government subcontracts with private contractors, just like we do with war, right?
Yep.
So what we do is we've privatized most of our federal and state prisons in particular to a degree to where it started with things like they would handle the laundry service or they would handle the food service, because that all used to be run by the state, right? When I say state, I mean with the capital S. So it started with that. Now we have entire prisons where the entire operation has become privatized. And there are multinational corporations, and some of which are the same that actually do send contractors to Iraq and Afghanistan. It's all the same stuff, right? It's all Disney and ABC. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, so and in order, like if you're a politician, there are politicians, particularly in certain parts of the country, like upstate New York, where people run on the like I'm going to bring prisons to the town kind of thing, because what they're really running on is I'm going to bring jobs to the town. But that's kind of the only way in a lot of economically depressed areas to bring jobs places is to bring prisons to places. So once you have prisons, what do you need then? Prisoners, right? Like you can't have prisons. If there's prison without a prisoner, then you're not making money, and that company's not happy, right? So what do? We arrest people for nonviolent drug offenses, and we put them in prison for a long time. But first, we kick them out of school. We started at a young age. This is part of the argument, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, but the school-to-prison pipeline comes out of that. I highly recommend that.
You see I don't mean to bring up more stuff, but you see the reverse, too, right? So I have a friend, similar feelings about Teach for America, but she participated in Teach for America, and she saw tons of students who, like, their goal every winter was to get arrested so that they had heating in prison. And so you kind of see the reverse where people are like striving to do like this, not too big of an offense, but they have a roof over their head and they have 3 meals.
Yeah, I think, see, my problem with stories like that, even as a qualitative researcher who believes very much in individualized narratives, I think sometimes those stories get sort of capitalized on and used and blown out of proportion as if there's this like large, like that the problem is really people who want to go to jail. Like, really? And I know that's not what you're saying, but I think that's the danger with those narratives is that they get blown out of proportion in terms of how many people are actually engaging in that. So yeah, and so this I just want to show you also is the imprisonment rates for each group. So we see in terms of disparities, they're pretty big, right? So here's white guys, and here's black guys, and here's Hispanic guys. And here's women. White women, black women. And so we see the racial disparity with women too. It's just that the numbers are smaller, right? But I mean, even though they're small, like that's like, well, it looks like in picture terms, right? That looks like 3 times, right? I mean.
Is this national?
Yes, this is national for. This is from the it's so weird. I didn't feel comfortable using any data after 2007 because it was just weird. This is from the United States Department of Justice. It was just really, there were so many like caveats and asterisks that weren't there. I don't know why, but pre-2007. So it's from the Department of Justice, and this includes all people in federal and state prisons. All states. Wow, it's 1 o'clock.